We go.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to lesson 9. Golly, lesson 9 of Inspector Call's remote learning, and we're going to focus on the inspector's speech, just a short little mini one first. And we've labelled it the question: is the inspector angry? So we're going to examine that a little bit today. So at this stage of the play, then all the characters have been interrogated. As we know, Eric and Sheila have felt the burden of guilt, whilst Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling refused to accept any blame. Goodness knows where the Gerald's wandered off to. He's gone off, claiming that he needs to sort of examine things. And the inspector has just had enough at this point. He is cheesed off with the Birlings, and he then leaves with his final prophetic speech, which we're going to be looking at in today's session. Okay, so let's have the speech. We're going to be thinking about what we understand about the final speech that the inspector gives. So this is just before he storms off. So we'll read through it first, and then we're all going to chime in and focus on the most important bits that you might want to pull out for key quotes to focus on in essays and things. It might be worth sort of noting the kind of symmetry of the play here, in the sense that obviously in Act 1 we have Birling's very pretentious speeches that he gives to the younger generation, as it were. He's chastising them and sort of talking about the future, and this speech sort of offers the antithesis, the complete opposite, in terms of how the inspector tries to lessen the characters before he leaves. So we'll read through it together first. But just remember this, he says: one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives, and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are all members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So that's the inspector's mic drop out. It's quite a dramatic party exit, I think. One I'd like to emulate. So let's jump in then. What would we like to say about the inspector's speech, guys?
Miss Harrison, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you go first.
Another dramatic pause. Video.
I'm usually the queen of the dramatic pauses.
Yeah. So yeah, as Mrs. Marshall's already said, this is a really dramatic and emphatic final message from the inspector. He's the one who really controls the play and has controlled the play from his entrance. As Mrs. Marshall said, this parallels nicely Mr. Birling's speech in the beginning, where we covered earlier on in the lessons, where he says, you know, a man has to look after himself, we'd all be mixed up like peas in a hive and all that nonsense. This is a nice kind of mirroring speech, but obviously the exact opposite in what the inspector's saying. The obvious things to take away from this is the socialist message that's coming through. I'm going to start at the top, and then we can kind of work his way through it and pitch in. The inspector says one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So Eva Smith, obviously, she's supposedly a person. She is a person, supposedly. She is a person. She's a character constructed by Priestley to symbolise and be emblematic of the working class in living in Britain at the time, in the Edwardian period. So while Eva Smith is a symbol to the audience, he's also saying, you know, there's not just one person like her, there are millions and millions and millions. And I think the repetition of that word millions is really telling of the amount of suffering as he says later on, that you know that their suffering is on this huge scale because of the capitalist society that was in place at the time. And obviously there's the reference to the Eva Smiths and John Smiths, which was a common name, also sometimes used as a pseudonym for people who have died, who they don't know the name of. So in America they call them John Does and Jane Does, whereas in Britain they call them John Smiths. So that could be something to note, in the fact that they don't see working class people, as we've said already, as living as human beings, as anyone with anything with any value. So that's how the Birlings view them. But here the inspector's saying, because you know Eva Smiths and John Smiths, especially that surname Smith was such a common name, he's saying that, you know, your selfish ways is impacting not just Eva Smith but everyone else like her. And I think the fact that that first sentence ends with the inclusive pronoun us, he's saying that it's again that socialist message of collective responsibility and you know everyone being part of a greater system, not just kind of these small bubbles of class division.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Miss Harrison, because I think with the repetition of millions, I think it not only highlights the amount of people that were impoverished during the early 20th century, like in 1912, when the play was set, but I think we need to sort of just think about the sort of the backdrop of the fact that when we think about the capitalist society, there were a small number of people that were profiting from the Industrial Revolution, weren't they? And what we've seen here is that when we have that, because it is quite hyperbolic, isn't it? Is that how you pronounce it? The repetition of millions. That
Hyperbolic,
yeah, it's that exaggeration there that shows you that the Birlings have failed to go beyond their lifestyle and their lives to help other people, because they have, for such a small number of people, they hold so much power that could have made a bit of difference. And just to add to the connotations of Smith, like Miss Harrison said, Smith was quite a common name, and it derives from, because I think in the olden days, when people had got given their surnames, or they were sort of linked to their professions, weren't they, in the Middle Ages? And so Smith is linked to someone who works with a blacksmith, who works as someone who works with metal, and that's quite a profession that's linked and synonymous with the working class. So I don't think it's an accident that Priestley chooses such a specific name for her. Again, when we look at Eva, you know, this sort of derives from you know, Eve. And we could look at the idea of the story of creation, and we could argue that again she's representative of womankind. And I really like this point I found from this is a book that I think me and Miss Marshall both have, from, I think, is it by Neil Bowen? Yeah, he's written a guide, and I think, you know, we should write it down and show you where you can get it, because it's quite good just to develop your thoughts a little bit more. And he said that Eve is representative of woman. Smith is representative of mankind, and she's similar to Eve, who was blamed for giving Adam the forbidden fruit. And so therefore she breaks out against the expectations that God gave her. And then we've got somebody like, and then they were like banished, weren't they? And they were like told to get out of the Garden of Eden. So Eve's kind of a bit like Eva Smith, sorry, is kind of like Eve, because she doesn't follow the rules, and she breaks the expectations of her, like of what a woman's supposed to be, and then she's sort of banished. And so what we've got here is that reminder that for someone like Eva, who's trying to sort of break against those expectations that she can't allow it because the structure of that she lives in is oppressing her. And so I thought that was quite a good bit to pick out. Are there any other bits that we could talk about?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely point. I think, I suppose, so far it's looking at that, the idea that it's not about the individual, it's about the masses, isn't it? And this speech is really, if any part of the play is going to be seen as Priestley's mouthpiece, it's this part where it's probably worth noting the idea that, yes, he's talking to the characters, but he's also talking to the audience, and there's a sense that he's really delivering his message home, which we'll come on to a little bit later in more detail. But yeah, so looking at kind of moving on to, you've mentioned it being kind of quite hyperbolic, the language. It's also very emotive, isn't it, the speech, in terms of if you look at the kind of the sort of, coming back to the point about it being the antithesis of Birling's speech at the start, if you compare the sort of the type of language that he uses, whereas Birling is very kind of self-important and all puffed up, etc. Inspector's speech is very weighty, which fits in with the description at the start, but it's so it's very measured and very emotive, as he is throughout a lot of the play. He deliberately tries to use quite shocking language to try to shock them into changing or realizing what they've done. But if we move on, sort of looking at the next part where he starts to talk about their hopes and dreams, isn't it? Their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives. So perhaps we could talk about that bit a little bit next, in terms of the idea of how he tries to think about the working classes as real people with real feelings, emotions that obviously the Birlings haven't taken into account, and their chance of happiness as well. This idea that we're all, in terms of the socialist message being delivered, the idea that their chance of happiness depends upon a small minority of other people, like Miss Swan said earlier, the idea that that a small percentage of people are kind of getting all the wealth and profiting and exploiting the working classes. But it's this idea that their happiness or chance of actually moving forward, of being upwardly mobile, is all dependent on how they're treated by others. We all affect each other. And so the word intertwined would be a nice one to zoom in on, just to actually think about that idea of we are all, they can't be separated. If you think about the definition of the word intertwined, if something's intertwined, think about when your headphone wires all get mixed up, although no one has them anymore, do they? How like old school and out of date am I that I have actual wires?
It's all about AirPods now, come on.
Remember that awkward moment where Miss Marshall tries to make a current reference to explain the word intertwined and then realises that everybody has Bluetooth headphones.
You'll be the last one laughing when everybody's lost their AirPods.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
But the very definition of the word intertwined, not forgetting about, headphones and all that, is the idea that it can't, it cannot be separated. It's difficult to pull apart. And so this is a fantastic word to zoom in on for kind of explaining socialism, the idea that you cannot do something without affecting somebody else. And this is what the play is about, isn't it? It's this idea that each, it's the chain of events again, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't really matter what one person does, it's then how it's affected Eva in the rest of her life. And even if she isn't one girl, even if she doesn't even exist, it doesn't change the fact that they have all done these things, that he's obviously trying to make them see how their actions impact upon others. And we can't, as a capitalist, you can't do something to profit without expecting to then exploit someone else, and that up until this point they haven't cared, and unfortunately some of them still do not care.
Yeah, I think
want to jump in this.
Yeah, I think the verb intertwine, how we said it was like the antithesis of Mr. Birling's speech. When I read that, it kind of gave me that memory of the bees in a hive, like bees in a hive, and how Mr. Birling was so scathing of it because he just thought that it was just a concept that was a bit ridiculous and just doesn't work, because he thinks that the way that someone's successful is they take themselves out of working together as a unit and focusing on themselves as an individual, whereas the intertwined, like you said, is like everybody's actions have an impact on somebody else. So even though they think they're like removed from the working class, if we are all one body, and Eva Smith is the embodiment of that, isn't it? That because she's connected to them, and because she dies, they're impacted as well because Eric's baby dies.
Yeah.
So I think that's like a point to make. So what shall we go on to next then, guys, with the speech?
Well, I think it might be, I mean, noted as well the sort of the use of the techniques that he uses as well in the style of language, because obviously with what we've mentioned so far, that you talked about the hyperbole and the repetition of the millions and millions and millions, but then we've also got repetition throughout the speech. We've got 3-part lists in there. I mean, if you're revising for language paper 2 and how to write a persuasive speech, could make a lot of notes from this in terms of the emotive language used. Think about your De Forest techniques, the direct address in there. It's almost like a political speech, and that's really important for your context as well, to note how Priestley really uses this as an opportunity to talk to the audience, as we've said. And it mentions in the Art of Drama book that we referred to earlier, that in 1941 Priestley's radio shows that he had, because he used to sort of give political speeches and things on the radio, were stopped. At the time, it was sort of thought that in the post-war environment that people should be kind of given the sort of more individual thought. But Priestley spoke out to say that he thought that his radio broadcasts were stopped because he was being too socialist in his views, and he felt that people had sort of censored him a bit and prevented him from kind of speaking out. And so therefore, like, this play, in a way, it mentions in this book how it can be seen really as his way of using the play to actually preach his ideas with more freedom, because obviously, in the guise of a piece of drama, you can say what you want and do what you want. So he's using the inspector, and this is really, really important for the higher grades. You absolutely must not write about these characters as if they are real. You constantly need to be talking about how they're constructed and what they're there for. And the inspector himself really is what Priestley wants to say. And so the fact that he uses the format of a sort of a political speech, not only does it make it more persuasive for the audience to agree with his socialist views, again, it really cleverly contrasts back to Birling, because that's the bit where he uses all the dramatic irony at the beginning to make Birling appear like a complete idiot. And then when he uses the inspector, he uses very sophisticated, persuasive techniques, very emotive language. It's very poetic in the way he speaks. And so therefore, it's very clever because he presents him as the superior character, as somebody that should be listened to, as opposed to the foolish Birling at the start. And therefore, he's very cleverly saying, well, look, socialism is clearly the one that you should listen to. It's clearly the more sophisticated political thought pattern, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the fact that if you juxtapose the inspector with characters like Gerald and Eric, they're kind of linked to dishonesty, aren't they? And I think the inspector's always been linked to truth. So when he's left at the end with this speech, it holds a bit more moral authority, because he's contrasted with such immoral characters as well. And I think that helps the case that Priestley wants to bring forward through the mouthpiece of the inspector. I think that's a point. What about this metaphor, members of one body? Miss Harrison, you have anything to say about this one?
Yeah, I was gonna jump in for this one. Yeah, I really like this one.
Jump in.
I'm jumping in. Doing a lot of the jumping. So yeah, obviously there's the kind of the connotations of social responsibility and collective responsibility that we've already mentioned. But something I found quite recently actually about this interpretation is that it can literally be, when you think about a body, think about a literal human body, and that no one major organ can survive without the other. So if the heart goes, then everything goes. If the brain goes, then everything goes. So it's this idea that whilst the Birlings are very comfortable living in their kind of separate social bubble, that's not for the benefit of everyone else. So I think that's a really quite that, like Miss Wan said, the metaphor of the human body, and that no one class could really profit with whilst others are really suffering, because that's not beneficial for everyone. In the long run, it's going to affect negatively everyone, as it does in the play. Edith Smith suffers, therefore the Birlings suffer. So,
but also that they can't live without the they need to realise that they can't live without the working classes. Their society would collapse as well.
Exactly.
They are relying on the working classes and those structures that are in place to be able to maintain their superiority and protect their position of privilege. So the one body's got to be a reference to the war as well, isn't it? Just after coming out of the war, we're all one body. Surely, if you've not, we'll come on to the references to the war at the end of the speech, but surely, having come through those 2 world wars, if any time was going to show them that they can't, we have to work together in order to move forward and to build a new society post-war. We are one body. You can't do this without us, I suppose, as well, isn't it? You can't sit at the top of your tree and think that you can just have your position and forget the rest of us.
I think this is where his kind of message to the audience is really coming in, because obviously, as we've said, it would be the younger generation, like the Erics and Sheilas, who would be listening to this and kind of taking that message forward into society once they'd left the theatre, and kind of moving society away from this selfish capitalist society.
Yeah, I could just imagine, this bit here, the actor that plays Inspector. I could just imagine him turning to the audience in this direct address, and I tell you, because it's like it's universal for everybody. It's not just the Birlings. It's this speech is, like we said, designed for the audience, designed for the generation that are going to progress forward to a more fair society. So it's just like a little memory reminder at the end, isn't it? The direct address there. Yeah. Shall we look at this last bit here? It just ends with a bit more emotive language here. Does he fire, blood, and anguish? This list is 3. Who wants to talk about it?
Well, I think it's a definite reference to the wars again, isn't it? The fire and blood and anguish suggests almost this idea, because obviously because the play is set in 1912 as well, it's almost like, I tell you the time will soon come. So he's almost kind of prophesizing this is what's going to happen. Look, believe me. And obviously there's a great amount of dramatic irony there, because I think the audience would their mind would immediately go to the war when they think of blood spill, and obviously the horror in their immediate living memory of what they've just been through. They will know exactly what the inspector's referring to when he's saying, look, basically, if you don't listen, you're going to be punished. Humankind is not going to survive unless we start to look after each other and work together and stop trampling on each other to get to the top. And so there's a definite idea that you need to listen or you will be punished.
I think it's definitely a allusion to the World War II, isn't it? About the damage that's done when people don't look after each other because of the power structures that have been put in play that it's led to war, I guess. I don't know if people can help with this, but do you think the last bit, the fire, blood and anguish, do you think it's links to the Russian Revolution in started in 1917, so just before World War One, and I think it was an uprising, wasn't it, of the peasants? Is that wrong? I don't know. I don't know if Yeah, do you think he could be alluding to maybe the working class taking action if it continues?
Okay.
So like a different spin on it. Like if you're
Right,
sort
yeah.
of not happy with your situation, you kind of need to do
Yeah.
something about it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a good point, because it mentions in the art drama book as well about it being the speech kind of linking to the idea of Clement Attlee's revolutionary ideas post-war as well, sort of the kind of movement towards his campaign, his successful campaign of being elected as Prime Minister when everyone thought that the Conservative Churchill would have won. So yeah, it could be almost like a warning, like the working classes will rise up, you mean?
Yeah, and so, and then actually, you're sort of maybe it is a warning to the upper middle classes and the upper classes that you need to sort of be treating people better. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's all. That's all. That's all. That's all my notes. I don't know if anybody else has got any.
Have you also been listening to Rara Rasputin by Boney M? Just to prepare for
I do like that song.
Love that song.
It's so
That's
funny.
all. When you said Russian Revolution, that's all I can think
Yeah,
about.
Rasputin.
Yeah, the lover
Was
of
he the
Russian
guy that
queen.
like could prophesy things?
Yeah,
That's why he was like best friends with the king.
yeah. Don't write any of this down.
No,
listener.
don't.
Just go and watch.
Don't write anything down, but
and you'll
immediately
find out
stop
everything.
this, and go and look for Rara Rasputin on YouTube by Boney M, and then attempt to do the dance. Just a little revision break.
Yeah, a definite revision break.
Yeah.
Shall we stop this PowerPoint and then we can do the second one? We're doing a double.
Yes.
Double
Although I have
session
one more
today.
thing to say about it.
Yeah. Oh, go on then.
All I was going to say is that we haven't mentioned the kind of biblical language as well.
Oh.
We probably have in class with our classes, but just maybe that's as another thing not to forget in their annotations, the kind of sort of references, so quite religious language in it as well. Perhaps kind of, maybe Priestley wanted to sort of link socialism to almost kind of Christian morality. It's almost it's a moral speech, isn't it? And then maybe there's an idea that he wanted to kind of link that together as well in order to sort of, again, elevate his message in terms of some kind of, Christian redemption, I suppose, maybe.
Yeah, I like that.
Something that I have mentioned to some of my students before is the idea that each character represents or kind of symbolizes one of the 7 deadly sins. So
Yes.
like Eric is love, Sheila's envy, Birling's pride. So it could be, especially with the fire, blood and anguish, and the biblical reference, because all of these characters have committed one of the 7 deadly sins, that, will there be kind of punished not just in life but also in death.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that.
I like that. That's cool.
Yeah.
And also that means that you should go and watch 7 after this as well.
Oh gosh. I mean, not probably not at night time. I feel like it's really dark.
If Helper's heads in a box.
It just reminded me of the I'm not going to do any spoilers, but the box.
The box.
The box.
Don't open the box.
Just don't do it, Brad Pitt. Right, shall we stop there then?
I've got a Priestley quote to end on.
Oh, okay, well, sorry.
So this is actually from him, and might just be good for those show-offy grade 90 people. He says, to move forward and build a new society post. This is about, he's talking about moving forward and sort of creating a new society after the war. He says, we must stop thinking in terms of property and power and begin to think in terms of community and creation. So that was kind of what he said in his radio shows that were stopped, and fits very much in with what the inspector says in this speech, really. Hence
the Minister of Information wasn't happy with him, was he? So he was like, can't say
not.
That. So I'm going to write a play and in your face. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Shall we do the next one? I'm going to stop this one. And we'll be back in a little bit. Right, okay.
Bye.
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 I need to stop the recording on this. Right.